again, thank you all for joining. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. San Miguel. Hi, guys. Thank you for joining. Like Randy said, this has been very much anticipated. We have been anticipating this as well, to be able to provide this to the team that's out there in the trenches caring for patients every day. And it was extremely important for us to be able to provide assistance and some guidance, because this is something that is brand new for all of us involved. So let's go right into it. So why telemedicine? It's really important to understand why we're doing this type of platform now with our patients versus before. Well, as everybody knows, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and because of this pandemic, we were forced to take a look at all our different options so we could limit exposure not only of the patients but of the staff and of our communities as a whole, but still providing that care. We knew that we needed to create and provide something to our patients where they could still receive our care and we could still protect them and our staff. So with everything that has happened and all the different guidelines, and carriers have changed their guidelines as well as the DA and the state regulations have changed. So we were able to quickly go through a lot of changes and be able to roll out a new platform that is strictly temporary. We do need to understand that this is a temporary solution to our current problem, to our very current and very fluid problem that we're having. So it's really important that we do understand that we do understand why we have telemedicine now and why we didn't have it before. And I always like to really go through this a little bit even more so with the operations team, because they are so up to date on what the regulations have been and are now.
Yeah, so one of the things we know is that the DEA is going to be rolling back their easement of restrictions that allows us to prescribe anorectic medications via telemedicine on a federal level, even when not seeing the patient in person. Now, they still say that you have to follow all state regulations, and many states are permitting this. There are some that are restricting it, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Along with that, many of the easements from insurance carriers that have allowed us to begin billing as we normally would are temporary. And so that's one of the reasons that we want people to just go into this knowing that we're going to make every effort to retain whatever can be after this. It's a great learning experience for the company, but just keep in mind these are temporary, and you want to know that, and you probably want to make sure your patients are aware of that as well to some degree.
And I always like to say, you don't want to set false expectations for patients. You don't want them to think that this is the way that it's going to be from now on, that all their Medi weight loss visits are going to be via telemedicine. So that's always one of the tips I like to give providers and the staff, to make sure that they don't set those false expectations for their patients. So try to avoid saying, oh, well, telemedicine is finally here, and this is the way we do things now, because that might just set false expectations to patients that from now on all their Medi weight loss visits will be conducted via Telemed. Because we know that when this crisis is over and this pandemic is over, the DA, the federal and state regulators, as well as the carrier guidelines are going to change. And we don't know what those changes are going to be, but most likely they'll go back to the way they were. So something that's always really important. This slide I actually stole from Stacy Heald, and I really liked it because it really puts into perspective how quickly this has been done. And it was only a little bit over 10 days ago that the initial concerns and the concerns of COVID at that time were elevated to a full crisis management mode. At that time here at corporate, we truly understood and that it was time that we instated telemedicine formally for our franchises so we could continue to provide care for our patients. At the same time, there's personnel changes in the corporate office, so it was very busy times for all of us. Within a few days, about 2 to 3 days, we were able to, as a team, finalize the telemedicine platform and provide that it be rolled out to all our franchises. And it's just really important to understand that this entailed multiple billing considerations, which were constantly changing. The billing, the ability to bill and how to bill was constantly changing from not even a day-to-day basis. It was an hourly basis, as well as the state executive orders across the nation were changing. The carrier guidelines were changing at the same time, as well as the billing requirements. All this entailed also for us to change our EMR and provide different updates for us to be able to roll it out, as well as our marketing team providing the advantage resources to all of you out there so you were able to roll this out. So needless to say, this was less than 10 days ago, and it was only 1 week ago that the franchise system was completely updated and there was a formal introduction of telemedicine in our system. And we were able to even provide new service options like curbside service. So needless to say, these times have been extremely busy, fluid, and stressful for all of us. But here we are 10 days later with a brand new platform that is enabling us to continue to provide care for our patients. So again, I can't stress how proud I am of all of you who have just stepped up to the plate and said, you know, we need to be there, and you have been every day.
All right, so one thing I want to call attention to and remind everyone of is that there are a lot of resources available on Advantage regarding this current pandemic. One in particular is the Doxy.me informational resource. This guides you through the setup, and it was actually contributed by a franchisee out there. Bruno Tramontosi and Kim Kalous helped put this together. They were very early adopters. We really appreciate that. And then we were able to brand it and adjust and put it up on Advantage for you. If you are having trouble getting set up, or if your providers out there need a resource to learn just how to use Doxy.me, this area or this resource basically walks you through with screenshots how to use it, how to transfer a document to a patient or receive a document from a patient. So very helpful. And if you haven't checked it out, in the screenshot you should see there is a section under operations called COVID-19. If there's anything you can be doing within the Medi system to keep yourselves up to date, it's daily or even hourly reading the news posts and checking this resource area. This is going to be very, very helpful to you as we put more and more information out there. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about scheduling and some of the things that we're seeing clinics do in order to improve their scheduling and schedule for Doxy.me or any other telemedicine platform. Now, the first thing we're seeing is you want to use your EMR for scheduling. It's what you're used to. I would not recommend trying to use a different platform, and you do still need to make all the standard annotations and documentation in your EMR. So what we're seeing a lot of locations do, and it's working quite well, is they're updating their column headers, and that can be done in the settings of your EMR under schedule layout to identify which appointments are telemedicine. So they're making a telemedicine column. Now, if all of your visits are telemedicine, this might not be necessary because obviously then anything on the schedule you know is telemedicine. But many locations are doing part telemedicine and part in office. So that's just something to consider. Another thing we're seeing is a lot of locations are condensing their schedule into shorter days or variable times. That's something you need to take into consideration as we move through this, is whether or not you want to offer the same hours, varied hours, and what really works for you and for your teams. So just something to keep in mind. Now, the biggest one is going to be proactive communication and outreach. And a big proponent of this was Kim Kalous. Her Wakefield location, as we talked about on our last update call on Wednesday, is doing very well with their adoption of telemedicine. And she attributes that almost entirely to the patient outreach that she did very early on. One of the things that she is telling patients, or her staff are sharing with patients, that we found very inspirational and the patients found very inspirational, is that at the end of the calls, they're actually thanking them for helping to keep the economy going and keep businesses open and staff employed. And that's a very heartfelt thing. A lot of these patients have been with us for a very long time, and they love knowing that they're helping, they're still getting their treatment, they're still getting a value, and they're helping to keep things going and keep their Medi strong. So something to keep in mind. What you see up there is there's two phases that we're kind of referencing a phase 1 and a phase 2. This is not always a decision that you have the ability to make. In some cases, the state is making this for you. Fortunately, as discussed with Derek Kalous on Wednesday, there are many cases in which we may be considered an essential business, and you should be reading your emergency orders to help make that determination. But phase 1 is where we're offering both in-office and telemedicine visits. In that case, what many locations are doing is any canceled appointments, they're immediately reaching out and offering telemedicine. Any no-shows are getting immediate calls to offer telemedicine, and they're regularly reaching out to their slipping and dormant list. And if you aren't doing it, if you weren't doing it before this pandemic, you should be calling them once a week. We would certainly recommend stepping that up and probably calling a little more often, maybe checking that list twice a week and offering telemedicine. Now, for phase 2, if you're moving to a strictly telemedicine platform in some of the more affected areas or for any reason, in that case, you would be calling everyone. We would be reaching out to scheduled patients, any cancellations in the last 7 days, as well as your slipping and your dormant patients. That's going to be very important, and we really think that it's going to help you get some of those visits on the books and get people scheduled. Do not wait for them to call you or for them to accept. You got to be outreaching to these patients. All right. Now, prior to the visit, you want to confirm all appointments with patients. Make sure that they're confirmed and annotate that on the schedule. Now, something very interesting we've been hearing is that the no-show and cancellation rate for these telemedicine appointments in the clinics I've spoken with is extremely low. In fact, much lower than it was before. People are making these appointments and keeping them because there's not a lot that can cause them to not be able to keep the appointment. So that's very good news. It means that if you booked 70 before the pandemic and only did 50, you might book 40 now and do all 40. So the gap is not as great, which is exciting. You also want to make sure you explain to them how to accept the invitation. If you're using Doxy.me, it's extremely simple, but some people might still struggle with it. Just so you know, there is going to be a resource that Gloria is going to upload to Advantage that is a patient resource to help them understand how to use this platform, and they are also able to e-blast that out to patients. So keep that in mind and reach out to your franchise consultant or to Gloria if interested in something along those lines, and keep an eye on the resources section as we discussed for that coming out soon, probably end of day today. Make sure you confirm their preferred contact method. You want to have a cell phone number or an email address for Doxy.me, and if you're using another platform, just make sure you know what is needed to set up that appointment. Now, something that Dr. San Miguel shared with me, and I'll let her speak to momentarily, is the next bullet. She experienced this in Tampa with some of her visits on Thursday.
Yeah, so a lot of times I had to remind the patient that it was extremely important to have a very strong internet connection for the video call and the telemed visit to go well. Not only for them to be able to hear us, but more so to be able to see us as well, and vice versa, for you able to see them. So things I experienced while doing these visits yesterday was patients would call maybe from their car. Not only is that not safe, but what happens is that it's not Wi-Fi, so it's going to be dependent on their their cell signal. So at that time, a lot of times I could not maybe see the patient, I could hear them, or could hear them and not see them. We had a lot of frozen screens, and it only happened on those patients who were doing it from their cell phone that didn't have Wi-Fi. So although it's not required that you have Wi-Fi and you can do it while they're on, dependent on their cell phone signal only, just know that it might create some issues. What I did at that time, just to make sure and try it out, is I did a diagnostics, which can be done through right there on that screen with Doxy.me, and all my connections were optimum. So I knew immediately that it didn't have to do with anything within the clinic, that it was mostly the patient. And what I noticed on 3 of those patients that I had the problem with, they were all on their cell phones in their cars. So just let them know that it is preferred that they be at least in the same location. When you drive, your cell phone signal gets weaker or stronger as you move along. So just know that that can happen. And it's okay if it does. You can always just call the patient back to send them a new invite or, whatever you have to do. But just know that these are issues that may arise, and they're not due to the platform at all, but rather typically the patient's cell phone signal.
So another one you want to keep in mind is you want to alert the patient of any data or information you wish them to be prepared to share. And we're going to talk a lot about that in a minute as we move into some of the clinical aspects, which I know everyone's very excited for, in terms of our recommendations of what the patient can self-measure, what can they provide you, what type of data should the patient be gathering, and can we trust and use in our documentation. But make sure that as we move through this presentation, you're taking your notes, you meet with your teams after this call, and you determine what you're going to want patients to try and gather for you so that you can let them know ahead of time and they can be prepared for the call. All right. So initiating the call, to initiate the call, you want to send the patient an invitation. Once the patient appears in your waiting room, if you're using Doxy.me, you want to click on the red dot to initiate the visit. And again, this is all outlined in much more detail in the resource that we have available. You may wish to use multiple devices to maintain access to the EMR and the patient's camera. So what we mean by this is you could use your phone or your computer for the webcam. Either way, you could lean that phone up against something and allow you to have a nice frame on yourself and see the patient, while documenting on your computer or vice versa. Tablets, anything like that. So if you have access to that, if you have multiple monitors on a computer at home or in the office, these are all ways that you can simultaneously chart and document and pull up results of the patient's past treatments while still maintaining good patient contact and good visibility on that patient's camera. Another thing you're going to want to do is greet the patient. Explain that the platform is HIPAA compliant and that nothing about the visit is recorded. You want them to know that and feel comfortable and safe. That way they understand that you're making sure that their safety is your priority.
Yeah, and a few notes on this slide. Depending on the platform that you have with Doxy.me, you could have either the free one or the professional one. Just know that with the free one, you do have to hit that copy button, so it copies the link, and then you copy-paste it using either your mobile device or whatever it is you're using. So just know that there's different ways. If you have the professional one, you can actually send the invite via text message or via email. Those are, I think, the two preferred ones at this point. All the other ones are a little kind of messy. The calendar one is a little difficult for the patient, and I thought it was kind of difficult on our end as well when we tried it out. So I do recommend you try to stick with either the text messaging or the email. And my other recommendation is if you are using two devices and you are in a location, just make sure that your cell phone is linked to the Wi-Fi of wherever you're at. A lot of times we use the cell phone to make the call, and then we forget to link it to the Wi-Fi, so that might contribute to poor visibility at that time. And I always like to say, if you haven't seen the patient before and it's a new patient to you as a provider, even though they are a follow-up clinic, make sure you greet yourself so they know. It's a lot different when they see them in person. There's always somebody saying, well, you're going to see, so-and-so, and so they kind of know you by name. But when we're doing this platform, that doesn't happen. So just make sure you say hi, and you greet yourself so they don't feel like they're talking to a complete stranger. And it is extremely important that you let them know that nothing about the visit is ever recorded or saved in any system. And let's go over a little bit about documentation. General tips, all the documentation is still going to be in the EMR as usual. None of that is going to change. You're not going to be documenting through Doxy.me. That's not what the platform is for. The platform was established basically as a secure connection pathway for patients and providers. So it was not ever meant to be a system of documentation. It was actually, we know that the best thing to do is where providers keep their documentation in one place. So you will still be documented in our EMR as usual. And it's really important that there has to be a clear annotation in that EMR encounter that the visit was conducted via telemedicine. So it's extremely important. There is no designated place for that. My recommendations are that this be decided upon on a location basis. So your medical provider as well as your staff should get together and agree upon a specific area in the chart that will be specified. So that way, at any given moment, somebody is going to look at that encounter and know exactly where to go to know if that visit was done via telemedicine. So there's a few things that need to be in that annotation. One was the fact that the visit was conducted via telemedicine, and two, who was on that call along with their location. So the best thing to do is create a common entry in one of the specific boxes in our EMR, and that way you keep it consistent to where it is, and you're able to just enter the specific details. So make sure that you do that. The slide coming up will show an example of that common entry. At that time, you want to make sure you annotate any vital signs or biometrics or information that was self-measured by the patient. So what I greet the patient and I ask them, how did your week go? How have you been doing? Tell me a little bit, have you been able to weigh yourself? Do you typically monitor your blood pressure? Do you happen to have a blood pressure monitor at home? And all those things, right? So hopefully my front staff has already alerted them that I will be requesting these, so they will have those on hand. At least in the Tampa location, my staff was wonderful at doing that, and most of my patients had everything ready for me when I went ahead and performed that call. So a lot of them, to my surprise, patients who didn't even have blood pressure issues already had their blood pressure and would say, I've been monitoring every day and my scale, and they would do all that. So just make sure you annotate at that time all that different information that the patient is giving you. And again, just make sure that the staff and everybody knows where this consistent place of documentation is going to be. And this is what the common entry, a sample. Of course, you can create your own. We just created this one for all of you who didn't want to kind of come up with their own. So the following visit was performed via telemedicine with the purpose of providing continuity of care for this patient during COVID-19 pandemic crisis. So in the future, if any of these charts are ever audited, this is always front and center. Okay, this was done via telemedicine, but they were consistent with any guidelines at that time of service. The location of the patient at the time of the encounter was blank, and the location of the provider at the time of the encounter was blank. So it's extremely important to always make sure that this is done in each and every encounter. So let's go a little bit into the details and a few guides on the documentation. So the chief complaint and the HPI and all that continues to be the same way they have been previously. So finally, at least something that has not changed. That is still what we're used to. Just remember, the 99213 is going to require one or more elements in the HPI and at least one in the review of systems. 99213s do not require updated past medical history, so that's something that you can skip if you're planning to bill a 99213. Although if you're in the frame of that it's going to be a 99214, just remember that it's going to require those 4 or more elements in the HPI, at least 2 in the review of system, and requires update to at least one type of past medical history. It's either personal, family, or social. So as long as you have that documented, this all stays the same.
And one thing to keep in mind, I know a lot of people have been talking about billing based on time. We will be talking about that in a little bit in a billing section where we can talk about what we're aware of and what we've seen in terms of billing based on time, but we still do recommend trying to get reasonable amount of documentation. And in a lot of cases, billing based on complexity is easy to do and more accurate and more relevant.
And going on to the next slide, so let's go into a little bit about vitals and biometrics. It's extremely difficult because it's not what we're used to. We're used to being able to take patient measurements, not only on our Tanita scales, but manually blood pressures, taking them with a nurse who has been trained to do this, and all of a sudden all this has changed, right? So a lot of you have asked me throughout this week, how are we going to feel comfortable prescribing to patients we don't have blood pressures on? My suggestion, and this is just a suggestion, I have requested that my patients get home blood pressure monitors. This is going to be particularly important for patients with high blood pressure, even if they've been well controlled in the past, as well as patients who are on those anorectic prescriptions. So my patients, a lot of them, like I said, have blood pressure monitors at home for some reason. But this is something they can easily get at either a local pharmacy or they can order it online. They typically run about $30. So this is something that still might be viable for some of the patients. Amazon Prime is still delivering and on time, so it's something that they can definitely get if they're willing to do so. And if you, as a provider, believe that it is necessary for them to continue their prescription. So don't hesitate to request this from patients. What I've always said, and you'll hear me saying this throughout this whole webinar, is there is no state of emergency that is going to supersede your clinical judgment. So it's really important that you continue to use proper clinical judgment for your decisions. So if you believe that this patient needs, maybe not weekly, all of a sudden, maybe you could be more lenient in that. But you could say, please, I would like for the next appointment, if you could please somehow get your blood pressure taken and have it available for me for the next visit. I think that is very reasonable to do and something that should not be hard for our patients. And at least I didn't have any issues. I thought I would have a little bit more kickback from patients or saying, listen, it's not the time to be asking me to go buy things, and it's not the time to go telling me that I need to do something else when I'm so busy. And my patients were very open to it because they do understand how important it is to monitor their blood pressures and their pulses through these times. In addition, some of the patients that might be completely stable in the past on their blood pressure medications either might be going low because they're losing a lot more weight, or might be going high because it's stressful times. They've lost their jobs, they have kids at home. So I think this is extremely important to monitor. So just don't be afraid and don't hesitate in requesting these from your patients. Again, some of my patients had a pulse oximeter. How somebody just randomly has a pulse oximeter at home, I didn't know that, but some do, and at least that would give me a pulse. So, if you do have access to that, that's great too. But don't be hesitant and don't be afraid to request that. In addition, patients, a lot of them have home scales. Most of them just give the weight, but I was extremely impressed on a lot of people, especially if they've had weight issues for a long time. They do have the more advanced models that even can provide that impedance analysis. So a lot of them had that ready for me, broken down into total body water and everything else and fat percentage, just like our Tanita scales. Again, if patients do not have, and I did run into that again yesterday, they do not have any scales at home, I told them that in order for me to optimally continue their care, it didn't mean I couldn't, but to optimally continue their care, I preferred if they could order a home scale online. Again, typically runs great scales for $30. There was a few for $19.99 that were very good. Again, something they can order on Amazon Prime or get at any of their local pharmacies, which typically these have maintained to be open. One of the things that I always say is make sure that they know that they should be comparing weights from the same scale. So make sure that they are not comparing it completely to what they would get from the Tanita. Every scale is different, works different. The Tanitas are very high quality and expensive scales, so they might be a little bit more accurate, but just make sure that they understand that the importance of all this is to compare weights on that same scale. So from now on, we'll be using, until this crisis finishes out, then we'll be comparing to that same scale. So just make sure they don't get discouraged if it's vastly different. So going into a little bit about ketosis and journal review. I did recommend to all my patients to do home ketone testing. This is my personal preference was to tell them to continue to do it on a daily basis. Why? Because I think that because of how ever-changing these times are, how stressful they are, and how different to their norm they are going to be, I think it's extremely important that they monitor every morning if they're still in ketosis or not. And I tell them, if you're not in ketosis the next morning and you were before, take a look at what you had for dinner. Take a look at what you were snacking at night, and just know that that's throwing you out of ketosis. This lets those patients understand even better what they can and cannot do and what throws them out of that fat burning mode. So I do tell them to please try and continue to utilize the ketone strips to be testing for ketosis. And just know this is documented as normal. Just make sure that when you do document it in the comments section, you do an annotation that it is self-reported via telemedicine. So that is something that can even be added as a common entry in those boxes as well. With their journal review, I think out of the calls that I did yesterday, only about one had a journal for review, and I totally understood that. But just know that they can do this through the SPW, and you can bring it up on that second monitor where you have the EMR pulled up, or they can still do the paper. The paper can be done through document transfer through the Doxy.me platform, or some of them can just either read it to you. I actually had a patient that was in their car, and they went ahead and just showed me the paper journal through their cell phone while they were doing this. So they did pull over. They promised me they would pull over. So just be ready for those different scenarios, because I think as providers we need to be ready for that as well. So just going over the physical exam. So this is one of the areas where it gets extremely challenging. Why? Because the patient's not there physically, right? So it's really important that we do an annotation that it was done through observation only. But there are a lot of things that can be seen and observed during a telemedicine visit. And you'll see that as I go through the organ systems, you'll see that if you add them all up, they should be adequate for a 99214. So in constitutional, it's easily observed if they're active, alert, and oriented with just questions without any evident abnormality. There's no sign of distress observed throughout the encounter, right? So it's really important that you use those words. No signs of distress observed. Doesn't mean that they weren't there. You did not observe any during your encounter. There is no sign of overt edema or swelling noted throughout our encounter. So if you were going to have a patient in fluid overload for some reason, or you suspected some type of hypernatremia or anything like that, you would see this right when the patient gets on the telemedicine encounter. So you can document that either in constitutional or in cardiovascular. Patient does not show signs of overt edema or any pitting edema when prompted to press down on the dorsal aspects of their hands and feet. And this is something that's used very commonly. I went through a few websites, and a lot of, especially nurse practitioners that work at minute clinics and are doing telemedicine through minute clinics, they do ask these because it's extremely important when you think of it, of patients who come in with either coughing or shortness of breath, and you're not really sure, is this a cold, a bronchitis, or could this patient be having congestive heart failure complications? So this is something that is commonly done. You ask your patient to kind of press down forcefully without any pain on the dorsal aspects of their hands and feet and kind of demonstrate at least their hands to you through the monitor to make sure there's no pitting edema. Respiratory, what you can observe, that's what you can document. The patient shows no signs of tachypnea, so no signs of that respiratory distress or shortness of breath. In the abdomen, you can say the patient isn't bent over backwards in evident pain, right? So there is no signs of apparent pain or discomfort during the exam. The patient is talking to you normally, and they are laughing and saying, I'm really excited how this is going. There is no apparent pain or discomfort. Instead of during exam I'd rather it say during encounter, because it isn't a formal exam. So there's no pain when prompted to press down in the epigastric region or the right upper quadrant. So a lot of these times, because we know that some of these patients are at a higher risk of gallstones or anything like that, I would always just have them press down on that right upper quadrant and say, do you have any discomfort when you do that at all? They're like, nope, not at all. So that is something that I would always document. And then in the musculoskeletal region, you can always document that there's adequate range of motion observed when prompted to move extremities. Obviously, this was very limited to the patients who called me while they were driving. And then in the psychiatric realm, you can put no anxiety or overt depressive mood observed during encounter, and that their judgment and insight were adequate. So all of these that I have placed up here are things that can be done through observation only. So going on with the labs and diagnostics, as well as the assessment and plan, Most of the labs and diagnostics will primarily be irrelevant for telemedicine, except for two exceptions. One is the self-reported ketosis. So when that patient talks to you about when they've been testing ketosis, make sure you do annotate that in that tab in the E&M section, as well as when you are doing week 2 lab reviews. So make sure that you do not forget about these patients that need their labs reviewed. You still need to do this, and it's extremely important. And make sure that you do your proper annotations in the lab review tab, especially if you want to be able to go back and check your notes later. So extremely important, as well as the assessment and plan should be documented as usual. Again, you want to consider amending the treatment plan to address telemedicine visits. So when you're doing your assessment and plan and you're talking about follow-up, just make sure you say something like, spoke to patient, let her know that for now, due to the pandemic crisis, we will continue to do her visits through telemedicine, and patient agrees, and we will call her using this platform at the next visit. So those are different things that you can use to annotate that treatment plan, and patients know that they'll be addressing their next visit at a telemedicine visit.
So in terms of prescribing, wanted to take a minute to go through and talk about what we know about prescribing. And some of this information, and most of it has come from the legal team here at Medi Weight Loss. So if you have the option to go to the following link, you can see it up there. It's a little long, but it's not wildly complicated. This will be recorded in case you need to reference it later. And you can find this pretty easily by Googling it as well. But it's essentially the, adjustments that have been made for telemedicine due to this pandemic federally and nationally that allows us to prescribe controlled substances to existing patients for continuance of care. So that's something that is on a federal level. That does not mean that your state has waived any restrictions they have. You do need to make sure that you're trying to stay aware of that. Something that the legal team has shared is that a lot of people are operating under the assumption that the clinical care and the continuance of care is paramount, and it's more important. And people need to understand that if their state has restrictions and they're going against those, that they're taking a risk, and it should be a calculated one. So try to investigate your state guidelines. You can do this by calling pharmacies or calling the state boards. Now, in terms of how to prescribe during this crisis, you can dispense if you're offering curbside pickup. So earlier in the presentation, we talked about a phase 1 and a phase 2, which basically was phase 1 is open for in-clinic and telemedicine. Phase 2 is telemedicine exclusively. Now, if you have staff on site in the clinic and are offering curbside pickup, then you can do curbside pickup medications, provided that that's not contradicted by any type of state regulation or by Board of Pharmacy. Now, for prescribing, now this is all subject to state requirements. As you've heard us say a couple times, you need to review emergency orders, and you need to call local pharmacies to determine what is an acceptable form of prescription. Some of the ways that we're seeing this handled: calling scripts into a preferred pharmacy is obviously quite simple if it's accepted. Many states will not accept call-in scripts, and many of the stricter states won't accept them even now during this pandemic. Faxing scripts to a preferred pharmacy is an option as well. Writing a physical script that the patient can pick up is an option, though it's probably not very convenient. And the last option, which is probably the best option because most states are moving this direction, and if yours hasn't, it probably is soon, electronic prescribing. Our preferred vendor is RxNT. If you'd like more information about RxNT, first, please reference the Medi news posts about it by searching those letters, RxNT. And you can reach out to Jordan Evans with any questions. His contact information is in several of the news posts. You're also feel free to reach out to your consultant. We have worked with these, all of us have, and we're pretty familiar with it and can help you get onboarded quite quickly.
Yeah, Chandler, one of the things that I've seen that's really important to understand is if the patient has been receiving the medications because you have been dispensing them, when you call that prescription into the pharmacy, it is the first time that that pharmacy will be filling that prescription for the patient. And a lot of the pharmacies have the restriction that they will only refill scheduled drugs. they're going to see that as a new prescription because they've never filled that prescription there. So make sure that, like we said, you call ahead of time local pharmacies to see what they're accepting, in addition to your state and national guidelines. So even though it might be a refill for the patient because they've always taken it, you were dispensing it. And in the eyes of that pharmacy, it's their first prescription. So just be cognizant of that and know that that can happen.
All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about billing. And right off the bat, it's really imperative that you review your local emergency orders and that you ensure that telemedicine has been improved in your state for the types of services we're offering. Now, we are doing our best to help with that. You can reach out to your consultant. We're working with the legal team and the compliance team here to investigate these emergency orders. However, carrier guidelines are a little more difficult because we don't have access in most cases to the information that you do since we are not contracted with each carrier and we don't have access to their portals. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So in most cases, states are rapidly easing restrictions on billing of telemedicine. They're doing this to varying degrees. We're seeing that in many cases, the billing can remain identical. They're often putting in these emergency orders indications that basically billing will be done as it was and you will be paid as you were as though it was an in-person visit in order to combat the spread and reduce in-person office visits. Now, two things you need to be aware of that you probably are by now, but as a reminder, there are two modifiers in the system that should be used. The 9.5 modifier and the GQ modifier. The 9.5 modifier is typically used for any audio, visual, real-time telecommunications. So it's two-way, you can see them, they can say you, and video included. The GQ modifier is for an asynchronous telecommunications system. Our understanding is that would be used for things like telephones and things that are not quite on the level of something like Doxy.me or FaceTime. We're going to talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation when we do questions and answers to explain a little bit more about what would be all right to use if you can't use Doxy.me or if you're having issues. All right. Now, as usual, you can bill based on the complexity of the visit when selecting your coding. That should be done at your provider and your team's discretion based on what code they feel is most appropriate. Many locations are looking at billing based on time and using time as the key factor. So if greater than 50% of the time is spent counseling or coordinating care, the time may be a key factor in determining the level of E&M service. Now, what that means is if you have, let's say, a 26-minute visit and 15 minutes of it, which is more than half, is spent face-to-face counseling through this Telemed platform, you may be able to bill a 99214. So you need to be aware of that. You need to look that up. It's very easy to get research on this, and we can provide that to you as well. But essentially, time-based coding is an option. Now, one thing that's important to note that we've talked about here at the office a lot is that this is generally supposed to be the exception, not the rule. You still should be trying to get your complexity level because from our understanding when reading these guidelines, this is not meant to be every visit every week. This is more of a rare case. Where it was an exceptionally long visit.
Yeah, and a lot of the things that I have read and been taught in the last few years is that, like Chandler said, this is something that should be more of an exception because it is counseling and education and coordination of care, right? So insurance carriers don't intend for this to happen every single week where you have to spend this enormous amount of time on coordination of care. And they have even separate codes for patients who need chronic disease management. And it is a completely different code set. So just be cognizant of that as well. If you tend to use the time as your driving force to your billing codes, I always recommend that you should always document your complexity, and your documentation and your coding should be based on the complexity of that visit more than anything else.
Yeah. Insurance carriers are currently covering limited CPT codes for services conducted via telemedicine. You need to try and determine what they're covering. They may be covering preventative medicine counseling in addition to the E&M. They may not be. It's something that is best answered by them directly, although we do understand it's difficult to get in touch with them. The states are putting out emergency orders on this, but that doesn't mean that there's always agreement between the states and between the payers. And there's certainly not between individual payers and each other. So it's very important to try and understand what's being permitted. And claims are submitted and processed as normal. There's nothing special you need to do. We've gotten a lot of questions about the O2 location, putting a different service location on the claim. There's a lot of stuff that happens automatically on the back end of Advantage. So if you're putting a 9.5 or GQ modifier in place, the system is going to take care of that sort of thing for you, and you don't have to worry about it. So the only requirements, aside from the documentation ones from a billing perspective, are using that 9.5 or GQ modifier appropriately on each code bill. All right. So, curbside pickup. If your location is offering curbside pickup, we highly recommend that your front staff call them to take order and payment ahead of time, and you can schedule your next visit in the process. We would not recommend doing a transfer of credit cards or anything like that by hand. You want to cut down on any of that interaction if you can. You don't want to be passing stuff that's handled as often as a credit card back and forth. So curbside pickup is a great option. A lot of locations are having good success with it. Some locations that are exclusively offering telemedicine are still offering curbside pickup. And in fact, some locations that are only offering telemedicine at their homes, with providers working from home in states with really strict restrictions, are having individual staff members or owners or managers in the locations still offering curbside pickup. So something to keep in mind. If you are not doing curbside pickup, please make sure patients know they can purchase online. It's a big source of revenue for your clinics, and it allows you to get continued cart monies through orders online during this time. All right, so let's talk a little bit about checking people out. How can we manage checkout? So this can be done in advance or post-visit. Some locations, a lot of them are actually, when scheduling the next appointment, they are pre-collecting any cost for that appointment. We're going to talk more about what charges to charge and costs in a little bit. But, they're pre-collecting that in some cases. And others, they're doing it when they call to confirm the appointment, either the night before or the morning of. And in even some others, they're doing it after, where once the appointment is completed, they're calling the patient, they are scheduling the next appointment, and they are then charging the patient. So it's really at your discretion which of those you follow. Now, if you are on site, payment can simply be collected over the phone from your franchise location using your standard credit card terminal. So that's pretty straightforward. Many of you have processed transactions like this before. If you are working remotely, you can have a designated staff member take that credit card terminal home, and they will be the one responsible for calling the patient to collect payment. Now, this is pretty easy. In most cases, it can be plugged directly into an internet line, and it will function. It often doesn't need to be set up at home or have any special settings changed. But if you need multiple people to be able to run credit card terminals, or you do not want to have to rely on only one person to do it, or you just want this as an option. Transnational, who is our preferred vendor, and if you don't use them, it's hard to beat their rates. They are offering a virtual portal that allows multiple users to get on and charge people through that virtual portal without having to actually take that device home. Please reference the Medi news post that was on 3/24 for further details and instructions on how to reach out and get that set up, because it can make things very easy in terms of being able to run credit cards remotely and safely. Scheduling the next appointment, it can be done by the provider or by the staff member. So in many cases, the provider has the best bond with the patient. And we recommend this even in our day-to-day within a clinic when we're not dealing with telemedicine. The provider often has the best results when trying to schedule. And what you don't want, and we get a lot, is, I'm not sure yet, let me figure out my schedule and call you back. We tend to see the providers get this pushback a little bit less than the front desk staff, and the providers often are very successful. So if the provider is going to book that next appointment, they would do it right through the EMR, right on the schedule, and then either that provider, if you're using the online portal, or a front desk staff or manager can call the patient to either collect today's charge or collect next week's charge, depending on how you're doing it, whether you're pre-collecting or collecting after the visit. All right, so a big part of this call that I know a lot of people have been waiting for is managing new patients and restarts. How can we, are we allowed to, are we able to? So for that, I'm going to turn it over back to Dr. San Miguel to speak a little bit towards how we're going to be accepting new patients during this pandemic.
All right, so there are multiple scenarios for this, and again, it's going to be subject to the discretion of your medical director and of your clinical staff, as well as your state and national law and emergency orders. So we can't stress enough to please pull those. They're very easily accessed through when you do a Google search and read through them. Have somebody who understands all these documents, make sure they read through them and know what those emergency orders are dictating and what has changed. As well as meeting with your medical director, because ultimately he or she is going to be the one responsible for the clinical outcomes. But one of the things that's extremely important is that the patient complete all their medical history via the online registration. This is going to be really important that they do not skip any areas and that they do fill it out in its entirety. So what I have seen before is that patients fill in part of it and then part of it leave it blank, and it's very easily skipped when done through telemedicine. So extremely important that when you do have this patient through the platform, that you go over their medical history once again, one by one, kind of saying, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. So I'm just going to go through these really quick, and I typically go through the most important ones, and those are the ones that I document the most. So that being said, it's extremely important that you go over their medical history, because it's going to greatly affect what your clinical judgment is going to be further on in the visit. Patient should have a home scale at home, as well as an automatic BP cuff. So that's going to be important, especially for new patients. These are the scenarios where you can't just say, well, it's okay that we don't know your weight, and it's okay that we don't know your blood pressure, and it's okay that, because it's not. It's the first time we've seen this patient, and it's extremely important to know what their baseline is and who we're dealing with. That's why we are a medically supervised program, right? Because we need to make certain decisions based on this patient's medical history and personal history and family history before prescribing what we want that patient to be doing, not only on a caloric basis, but also on the supplement. So that's really important to understand. We also want to be able to estimate that patient's resting energy expenditure. Because, as you know, that's based on this number that we calculate the patient's protein prescription. So one of the things that I did not know we could do, and we can, is we can actually attain the estimated RE using the online calculator. It's something you can easily put into Google, and there's multiple online calculators. They use a standardized formula, which is why we call it estimated REE. Versus our review that we use in the office, that is an actual where you actually measure it. This is going to be an estimated, so just make sure that patients know that it is estimated, and based on that, you'll be prescribing your protein calories.
And one thing to note, that's because I know a lot of people are probably wondering, which one do I use? And we're going to be posting a follow-up to this webinar right afterwards with a lot of resources for everyone. And in that follow-up, we will include a link to a calculator we recommend. We didn't here because then it's another link you got to write down, and it's a little bit of a pain. So we're going to put that right up in the Medi News afterwards so that you have clear access to one that we recommend.
And so the next bullet, it's extremely important that we kind of talk about this, because I feel this is the hot topic. Prescribing is not recommended to new patients at this point through telemedicine. Why? You really don't have all the information you need. You don't have an EKG, you don't have lab work, and typically the state restrictions are often forbidding of doing this. They don't want prescribers to be ordering scheduled and medication to patients they have never seen and laid their hands on. So it's extremely important that you understand that although there may be scenarios where patients have a complete medical history for you and it's completely negative, and they have very recent EKGs lying around in their home that they just had, I do not recommend you take EKG results without having the actual EKG to read yourself. I would never base my own, I would never base my treatment based on somebody else's reading of an EKG. I would have to have the actual EKG to read, as well as very recent lab work. So that being said, some of the patients might have this lying around. So again, this is going to be up to your medical director and to you as a provider. I always say there's no state of emergency. Again, I say it again, no state of emergency that supersedes proper clinical judgment. So don't forget to use your proper clinical judgment for these scenarios.
And it's important to note that in a lot of cases, the states are actually saying this is completely forbidden. So you'd be taking real risk in doing this, which is why we're really not recommending it. But there is one thing that we found really, really interesting and exciting that was recommended by a couple of clinics, one of which was Chris Tracy's clinics in South Florida. What they're going to be doing at some point, if they are fully shut down and they are unable to do acute visits, or they don't like the idea of doing acute visits, a possible solution for them that they've proposed that may be a real good option for a lot of people is to do new patients only as in-clinic. Provided that it's not against any emergency orders and that you can stay open as an essential business, you can see new patients only, do all of your acutes through Telemed, and then since you're seeing them in person for new patients, you can, as subject to normal guidelines, write a prescription. So in their case, what they've talked about doing, and in some others, is seeing maybe only one patient at a time or a very reduced patient load, sanitizing everything between patients, having the staff wear proper masks and PPE, and basically using that as the ability for them to not turn the faucet off, to not stop people from coming in and getting started. Because one thing we are seeing, which is very interesting, it's not everywhere, but some clinics are reporting that they're getting good leads, not necessarily as many, but the lead quality has increased. It seems like some people are sitting around, they don't have much to do, they are thinking about this type of stuff. So, again, not everywhere, it's early, but we don't want to just turn off new patients. And so that's a way that we've heard of a location that's going to be doing primarily telemed at some point, but we'll still be seeing new patients in clinic if possible.
Yeah, and one of the things that I was talking to Curtis about yesterday, I think it would, it is an idea to be able to say to the patient, listen, we have set this time for you. We have set an hour where there will be no other patients in our clinic but you. So they feel safe and they feel that they're not going to be exposed to all these things, right? Because I'm sure their family members are like, you're crazy. So what I recommended is that they tell the patient, you're going to be the only patient being seen during that hour. We will be properly disinfecting prior to your visit and after your visit. And please understand that my staff will be wearing extra protective equipment, not only to protect you, but to protect themselves and their family. So I always say that, one of our biggest responsibilities is protecting our own staff. So I do recommend that you do protect your own staff with PPE if you are doing these in-person new patient visits. And patients will understand why they're wearing masks and why they might be wearing a gown. But I think this would be a great option to be able to be still accepting these new patients.
Yeah, and so to be clear, basically you can accept new patients through telemedicine per Medi guidelines. You need to ensure you're still complying with any state orders, any emergency orders. We are not recommending the use of anorectic medications if you have not seen that patient in person. Many of these easements or restrictions that have been eliminated are allowing you to continue prescribing to people who have already been prescribed to, but they are not necessarily allowing you to write new prescriptions. And so for that circumstance, it is possible for you to see new patients in clinic, provided the state's permitting, and you can do that on a reduced schedule with a reduced staff in clinic while still managing your telemedicine visits from home.
Yep, and I can't stress enough to our providers to really just use their best clinical judgment. All right. Don't forget that, and even in a time of crisis, just don't forget your clinical judgment. So in those patients, so go back to slide real quick. Let me go back a slide. I'm sorry. So in the previous slide, one of the bullet points that I didn't go over is you can always, if this patient, you weren't able to see this patient, you can potentially, again, depending on your medical director's discretion, recommend Stay-Slim. If the patient has no contraindication in their past medical history and you feel that, you have spoken to them and they tolerate caffeine well and they say, oh yeah, I do Red Bulls all the time and double espressos and I tolerate it extra. Perfect, and they're 26 years old and have no history, and you feel that they would tolerate Stay-Slim and they're an adequate candidate for that, that would be another alternative. And we all know that the program can be done perfectly well using the Stay-Slim. So that's another option for patients, for locations who want to do new patients through Telemed and do not want to see them in person.
All right, so at this point, we're going to move on to questions and answers. We have a few questions that came in prior to the webinar that we thought were very good, and we wrote up some formal answers for them. And then we'll move into reviewing the questions that were submitted during the webinar, and we will do our best to get answers to as many of them as possible. I'm sure there are quite a few, so we might not get to all of them, but we will reach out to those individuals with answers. So the first question is, if you cannot connect via Doxy or an alternative platform, can a telephone call be substituted? So the answer is that in many states, telephone calls have been approved for telemedicine procedures. But it is extremely important to review your emergency orders. You have to make sure that your state is one of them. And it's not just the emergency orders. You also need to make sure you check your carrier policy. Now, another reminder, make sure you're using the 9-5 modifier in the cases where it's that two-way face-to-face communication, or not face-to-face, but video communication. And the GQ modifier would likely be more appropriate in those cases, but again, that's subject to some carrier discretion as well. Now, for questions regarding emergency orders, you are more than welcome to reach out to your consultant, give us a call, give us an email. We will do our best to get you answers on that. We do have the legal team working hard to interpret those emergency orders and at least be trying to understand them and give advice on them. For questions regarding carrier guidelines, that's something that's harder for us. We don't have access to those portals. So what we're recommending is that you call your reps, which is difficult at this time, but possible, and subscribe for news updates via your carrier website. A lot of these carriers are sending out emails talking about what they're doing for telemedicine, and they're sending them out to anyone who's subscribed. So you should, if you are not already, be subscribed to your individual insurance carrier portals. All right, next question is, are there plans to integrate electronic prescribing into Advantage to increase the ease and efficiency of our telemedicine visits? So, answer to that is, RxNT is actually already integrated with Advantage to a pretty significant degree. They work with PDC, who many of you have used for years, and they have an API connection with our system. So all patients, when you create a PDC account for them, it automatically creates an RxNT account. And a large part of the work done for e-prescribing is every time you have a new patient or write a script for a patient for the first time, you have to enter all their information into that website. So that process is totally skipped. We might do some further integration in the future, but it probably will not be in the immediate future, and there's not a ton more that can be done in the immediate future. If we were going to add like a link or a button that would take you to their site, you would still have to put in the script on that site. Their platform is the one that is compliant and that is able to do all this prescription. So, we're still looking at ways to integrate more. But for the immediate future, the integration we have is what we're working with. Next question is, what do we charge for telemedicine? Is it different for cash versus insurance? This is a great question. We're getting this one a lot. So first, right off the bat, cash locations, this is easy. This is very straightforward. You can charge the usual rate of $75, or you can offer any of the available discounts, like 10%, 20%, 50%. It's essentially at your discretion, just as always, what you would like to charge. Now, insurance locations. As normal, this is a little more complicated. So it's dependent on what coding is permissible. And what I mean by that is if you're going to bill a 99213 and a patient has a 10% coinsurance, they're going to pay a different amount than if you billed a 99214. So to some degree, this depends on how you code it. Most locations are utilizing standard E&M coding, as we've talked about. Now, this would mean that costs are based on their coverage and if the carrier has made any adjustments to their coverage due to the pandemic. Now, something that's been going around quite a bit, there's a lot of rumors flying around, and we're trying to understand where they're coming from, but people seem to think they have stopped all copays, coinsurances, or deductibles. And to our knowledge, that is not the case. There are some states and some carriers, select carriers, that are making that decision. It is few and far between as of right now from what we've seen, but more and more are doing it. So that would happen at some point in your market. We only know of a couple of carriers in a couple of states that have put out formal policies on this, and one of the ones we've seen do it is not actually following through from what we can tell yet. They're still processing claims as though the patients have a debt. And so for that reason, we are recommending that you move forwards with it as normal, with copays, coinsurances, and deductibles, collecting your normal amounts and letting people know that they might get a credit on their account because of any changes to their policy. Unless for some reason you feel confident or comfortable that that is not the case and that your carrier has made a policy change. All right. So next thing we're going to do is take a look at the questions submitted. So give us just a moment to pull that up. And if you have questions that have not been answered on the call and you're still on, please go ahead and put some of your questions into the question box, and we'll get to the ones we can. All right, so we have one question that I'll direct to Dr. San Miguel, and that is, what are clinics doing about injections? Are they still giving them or not doing them at all due to the pandemic? And I think, I'll let you speak to it, but I think the answer is it really depends on whether they're open or not.
Yeah, and so obviously it depends on if the location is opened and has some staff available that can do the injection. So not everybody can do the injections. Not everybody is trained and qualified per state regulations to give intramuscular injections. So again, really important, get with your medical director, get with your providers to see who can give those injections and when there's going to be, or if there's going to be, any providers on staff at a specific time. At least in the location in Tampa, we did have some patients that wanted to come in and get their injections. So we do schedule them because we don't want multiple patients at the location at the same time. So we do make sure that we schedule them. They just don't show up. We schedule them for these injections. And if your location maybe only wants to open once or twice a week and condense these in different slots, just make sure you do it smartly so you don't have a lot of people at the same time in your location. And again, that the staff has the proper protective equipment to be able to do this. And again, just go back to those enhanced protocols where you're disinfecting everything in between every single patient. So just be very cognizant of that. For those locations who are completely closed and only strictly providing telemedicine, I would tell them is to always make sure that you offer the metabolic mouse. And what I would say yesterday to my patients would say, they aren't as good as the injections. They are absorbed about 70 to 80% as compared to the injections, but it is better than nothing. And then I would have them either pick up the metabolic mouse through curbside, or I would have them go and shop online for them.
All right, thank you for that. So we have another question, which is, what's the difference between telemedicine versus telehealth? And I'm going to be honest, in our use of the word, they're interchangeable. We are not defining them any differently. Now, I will disclaim there might be a formal difference in the definition somewhere, but right now as we're rolling through this, you might see us reference telemedicine or telehealth or even virtual visits. All of those terms mean the same thing to us for our purpose.
And what I've read throughout this time that I've kind of been researching it, so there's different platforms that say that telehealth entails more of being able to provide a lot of educational resources for patients, not necessarily practicing medicine. So you do telehealth when you have either your MA or an LPN call them and follow up. So telehealth typically happens when the nurse goes out to the patient and then they provide through telemedicine, they have the doctor or the medical provider through whatever platform so they can see the patient and the nurse can tell them what's going on at the same time. So that is typically how they use telehealth, and they use the word telemedicine mostly when the provider is the one directly seeing the patient through the platform. So I hope that made sense. If not, I can provide a better explanation through questions.
And for us, fortunately, we're just using them probably somewhat interchangeably. We're trying to use telemedicine mostly, but anything you hear from us is just referencing any type of remote visit. Next question we have is, how specific does the location need to be when indicating where the patient and where the staff was? I don't believe it needs to be very specific. You can put patient's home. We have their home address on file. The idea is this is something we saw as a requirement in some carrier guidelines, and we did not see any indication of the necessary specificity. So we would just put something very simple as to where that patient was and where you were, whether you were in the office, whether you were at home, whatever that may be.
And I think this is mostly required because I think in an event of an adverse reaction or some bad outcome, they're able to say, well, you put here that they were seen they were at a nursing home or at a place where you could have asked for vitals or something like that. So when we say it's at their home, then I think, whoever audits the chart knows that they're unable to, there might not be a blood pressure cuff available. So I think that's why they say it's so important to put the location of everybody of where it was performed and who performed it.
All right. One other question, that was about kind of coding, was if a visit does not reach the 15-minute mark, but the complexity is appropriate for a 99213, can it still be billed as such?
Absolutely.
So it's important to understand that time-based coding and complexity-based coding are basically two approaches, and they're independent. If it meets the complexity, you can bill it. Now, that's subject to your discretion, and you should be talking to certified billers with Quest and with MTBC, your billing company, about that if you have any questions, or referencing some of the tools they've provided for us, like the chart audit tool. If you are going to use time-based coding, that's a totally separate coding, so that it's not that they both have to be true, it's only that one of them is used.
And it's basically determining what was greater during your visit. Was it a very complex visit? I've had patients that their diagnoses are just very complex, and I'm managing multiple things at the same time, and the complexity meets a 99214. And maybe I didn't spend that amount of time required, but if I use my complexity and my medical judgment as the driving force of that code, that's all that needs to be there. And we're just going through some of the questions real quick to get the ones that are most common.
So we got a question, would this PowerPoint be available on Advantage Resources? Yes. After this presentation, this will be uploaded. It won't be in the Advantage Resources. It'll be with all of our webinars in Digital Chalk. That's where we house all of our video presentations. Every one of our webinars about COVID-19, I believe, is being uploaded there. And all of our other training modules, and feel free to reach out to your consultant or to just your consultant if you have any questions on how to access that, because we do want you to have access to this.
And Chandler, this is a question for me as well, because I will get this. Are they going to be able to print out the presentation through Digital Chalk?
No, not from Digital Chalk. If you need that, we might be able to provide that if necessary, but, we would encourage that when you're looking at some of the charting we've done, keep in mind that these are samples. You should be making your own. You should not be copy and pasting. It might be similar, but you should be using your medical discretion to write your own notes based on the information contained in this call.
So we can put a printable reference guide up,
yep,
for sure.
Can we bill a 99214 without vitals? Well, if you meet the complexity or time requirements, I can't see why not, but we are not certified billers and coders. Gretchen, do you know of any reason?
So typically, before the COVID pandemic, right, you could absolutely never bill a 99214 without vitals. It was a big no-no. So right now, as you know, a lot of the rules are kind of lax. And so sometimes that may happen. So just, again, reach out to your billers and coders to see what the latest is. This changes every day, folks. This is changing. It's amazing to me how quickly these changes are taking place. So it's really hard for me to say, yes, it's okay, proceed, or no, it's not okay, don't ever do it, because this is changing all the time. And although we are very adamant about trying to stay up to date on everything, just make sure that you verify not only state but national guidelines on that to see where they are, and every carrier is going to be different.
All right, another question we have is, what determines if your clinic is in phase 1 or phase 2, being are they offering both or offering just telemedicine? That's a decision entirely made by the franchisee, as each location is independently owned and operated. Those aren't really official terms. We're using them to label them ourselves to understand what the operational status is of each location out in the field. But that's just a decision made, sometimes, like I said earlier on the call, it's made for you by the state if they put restrictions in place. Another question we have, how do you suggest scheduling both regular appointments and telemedicine appointments for the same provider on the schedule? That's a great question. There's a couple of things you could do. One thing that I would recommend, what I would probably be doing, is I would be making an appointment note that appointment is going to be via telemedicine. And that appointment note, I would probably use a specific color and a specific icon for that appointment note. If you're not familiar to schedule an appointment with an appointment note, you just schedule the appointment and then click on the appointment on the schedule, and there will be an appointment note option in the top right. And when you mouse over that appointment, you will then see the note in a color and with an icon above the appointment. That's probably the cleanest way to do it right now at this moment. You could also use two separate columns and just be cognizant of not double booking them, but I think that's a little harder. So I would probably go with an appointment. All right. How are centers performing pregnancy testing when required? So obviously they're not able to provide pregnancy testing when required. However, there are many locations that do not perform pregnancy testing other than on that first visit, and they rely on the patient reporting their last menopausal, last menstrual period. So it's something that your medical director needs to determine. And Dr. San Miguel, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I'm trying to go with the patient's LMP and making sure that that's going on. I do get worried, especially those PCOS patients who have lost a lot of weight, who I know are a lot more fertile now and are used to being very, very lax in birth control because of their PCOS, and all of a sudden they are more fertile because we've just shut down all that insulin and there's a lot more ovulation going on. So it's hard for me to do that, but I do rely on their LMP for now, and I do urge them, I do educate them and say, don't forget that you're on a prescription that is contraindicated during pregnancy, so please continue to exercise prevention and being able to do even anything that has to do with over-the-counter things to prevent pregnancy, and make sure that if you're not sure if you're pregnant or not, that you do check. So I do kind of put this on the patient right now because of the times and because we're not able to do it any other way. I tell them the importance and why we do it and make sure that they try to do it on their own.
Doxy.me has an option to screenshot during the visit. Would it be advised to have a picture of the patient to verify the visit patient to record in their EMR? I would not recommend that unless, Dr. San Miguel, you feel differently. I don't feel that it's necessary, and we're telling them nothing's being recorded or saved in terms of that communication. So I think you can as normal document it via the documentation. I don't think you need to take a screenshot. Do you feel any differently, Dr. San Miguel?
I don't, mostly because we have so much information on the patient. This happens a lot, and it is a little bit more important when you're providing telemedicine from one of the minute clinics like CVS and things like that, where providers are constantly saying every single patient is new and there's no real continuity. This becomes a lot more important, especially for verification of the patient that you provided services on, and to prove to insurance carriers. So things like that. That's why that feature is in Doxy.me, not specifically for these times. So, if that's something that your location wants to provide, then by all means, but we don't believe at this time that it is necessary.
We're getting a lot of questions about PPE. Wanted to kind of try and address them all. So, PPE is going to be difficult to source in a lot of places. However, it's basically the responsibility of each clinic to try and get it. You're each going to have to look at the channels that are available. We're trying to work with Henry Schein to see what they have available and asking franchisees to do the same. It's going to be each location's job to source PPE if needed based on what you're offering. Not every clinic needs it. Not every clinic is in a tremendously affected area. So when we reference the option of having new patients in the clinic and doing one by one with decontamination or sanitization between, that's in the most extreme cases where you are closed to anything except for new patients, and not every clinic is there. In fact, I don't know of any clinic that's quite there yet, and there's a lot of clinics that might not get there. It just depends on your decision making. So we recommend PPE. if you can get it, it's still advised. But not every location is in a situation where they're, at that extreme level we discussed.
Yeah, Chandler, and I do, like I said, one of our biggest responsibilities is to protect our own. So those clinics that are seeing patients and opening their locations still to either new patient visits or injections or things like that, I do recommend that there be PPE provided, at least the necessary masks. And again, these aren't masks to completely protect you to be around this patient 24/7, but just to understand that, you are going to have some exposure, but it's going to be limited. Be very smart, folks, about the exposure that you have. You don't, you can do a lot by just some certain measures that you take, and I invite you to go to the enhanced protocols and take a look at a little of the things that you can do to limit your exposure. But I do recommend at least a mask and some of the clear goggles or just regular glasses if you wear some. In addition, you can do some type of gown that you dispose of within between each and every patient. So those are different options.
One last question we had, which is a very good one, in my opinion, is how do we handle the starter kit for new patients and restart lungs when doing telemedicine? That's a great question. So there's a few options, a few scenarios. If it is a telemedicine new visit done completely remotely, then obviously the only way to get them that would be to give it to them via curbside pickup if you were giving it to them from the clinic stock, right? So curbside pickup is certainly recommended, and that would be the best option. Now, if you cannot offer curbside pickup or are not going to offer curbside pickup for any reason, then the next best option would be for them to order it online. Once they have become a patient of your clinic, you will get a margin on that, and you have full transparency, as always, to see that order, and they would receive it. Now, in the EMR, for new patients, you cannot remove the charges. So for Restart Lungs, you can. So for Restart Lungs, that shouldn't be an issue. If you can't do curbside pickup, you can just X out of those charges. What I'll do is I'll speak with the IT team and the executive team here. We'll determine how best to handle new patients, because that's something something we need to figure out, and we will put it in the follow-up news post that will go up. What the recommendation would be. And if you have any issues or questions, please let us know. We're all working through this together in real time. Something we didn't mention on this call, but I believe we mentioned on the last call, was that we have removed the requirements for some of the charting, such as vitals and things like that used to stop you from closing out a visit. So you should be able to close out a visit even without putting in that piece of information. So there are some EMR changes that will need to occur and that will continue to occur based on what we run into. All right. So we're getting also a lot of billing questions. I think we addressed a couple of them as best we could. There's a couple more, 3 or 4 more. One thing that's really important to understand is that a lot of this is state and carrier specific. You definitely need to reach out to the carriers, and you need to reach out to the billing companies, to MTBC or to Quest, regarding any questions you have. Not every carrier is going to want these claims the same way. Not every carrier is going to want them coded the same way. We've even seen a couple cases where they want modifiers slightly differently, but it's often one carrier in one state wants it one way and another carrier in another state wants it a different way. So just keep that in mind. I believe that is all the questions we have. Let me see if we have any new ones. All right, so the last question we have is regarding the electric blood pressure cuff. Is it okay to use an electric blood pressure cuff during this time? Manual is typically preferred by providers. Yes, absolutely. I'll let Dr. San Miguel expand on that, but not only are we recommending that for at-home use for any patient that can get one, but it's often used by providers across the system. In my experience opening clinics, a lot of providers prefer manual, as do I, because it tends to read a little bit more accurately, and it's not a one-size-fits-all as much as the automatics are. But Dr. San Miguel, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so obviously, if somebody knows how to take manual blood pressures and has been properly trained, and you have the equipment that you can do it, not only, if you have a smaller arm to be able to change the cuff, and if you have a bigger arm to use a bigger cuff, things like that, but that's not usual in the home setting. So in the home setting, it is advised that patients have automatic cuffs. Why? Because it's going to be more accurate given the limitations that they have on user limitations, right? So one of the things I always have people understand is that each and every blood pressure cuff, these automatic ones, have different instructions. So I've seen some that want the patient to have the arm out extended at heart level. Others say they want it bent and over the heart. So each and every one are different. Make sure that your patient, you make sure that they go over the instructions on how that monitor works best and is most accurate. So that's one of the things you can tell them. You can get one, just make sure you read the instructions carefully on how to operate them. Every single monitor that I've ever seen my patients buy has literally a foolproof, all its instructions with pictures and exactly how to do it. So just let them know not to expect a 20-page super complex way. They typically have it all in images and pretty easy to follow.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. San Miguel. Thank you so much, Chandler. We have a lot of you typing in thank you to Dr. San Miguel and Chandler as well.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for helping us get through this tough time. And this has been one of our highest attended webinars of all time. So thank you everyone for making this a priority and being on the call live today. We will follow up with a news post that has a brief recap of everything that we talked about today. We did record this webinar. It'll go up on Digital Chalk, and then we'll make that printable resource as well. So thank you so much, and stay safe out there, and we'll be in touch with you soon.
Bye, folks, and thank you.
Thank you, everybody.